Okay, today we're going to look at indicator 6.3, and we're going to be talking mainly about the stock market crash, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the emergence of the Federal Reserve System. Looking at this first slide, we're going to pick up with the beginning of the 1920s. And of course, during that time period, many saw it as a period of prosperity, especially in the beginning. Many thought that the prosperity and the success would just keep going. Wages, production, the gross national product, and the stock market all rose significantly at the beginning of the 1920s. Okay, so prosperity continues into the 1920s. And again, it was based mainly on the sale of houses and automobiles. Consumers, for the first time, could buy houses and cars on the installment plan, which we discussed in the last indicator. This led to a lot of job growth. Jobs for workers who built homes and cars, jobs for workers who built furniture and appliances, jobs for workers who produced steel and other materials that were used to produce cars, jobs for business firms who built new plants and bought new equipment, jobs for workers who built and paved roads for the new automobiles, jobs for workers for electric plants and water and sewage facilities. All of this prosperity and all of these jobs were coming as what we would refer to as the multiplier effect. The prosperity of workers in all these industries allowed them to spend a lot of money. They're going to provide income for other jobs and for other workers, income which they would turn and spend to buy other goods and services. And again, economists call this spread of such new spending the multiplier effect. One person's spending becomes income to another person, who in turn can spend more and add to the income of others. But the prosperity of the 1920s is eventually going to start to head in the wrong direction. Remember, we've talked about mass production, and of course, all of this mass production meant more goods to sell. And the problem was even though they were mass producing a lot of these goods, the wages for the workers actually were not going up at all. And of course, I mentioned this too in the last video, how some of the workers couldn't even afford some of the products that they were helping produce, which means there was less consumer purchasing for all of these goods that were being mass produced. In return, businesses needed less workers because they weren't selling goods, and they were forced to lay off their workers. And then, of course, the final thing too, that the workers couldn't pay some of the loans that they had taken out to buy houses and automobiles and other things, and even investing in the stock market, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. They borrowed money to even invest in some cases. Remember, installment plans and borrowing on credit. All of this is going to eventually spiral out of control, and we get a boom. And this boom means that the banks are going to start to close, and people are going to begin to lose their life savings during this period. Okay, like we talked about with mass production, we also see some problems in farming. We had a downward farm spiral that went on in the 1920s. Once World War One ends, we discussed this in some earlier videos. Remember that the farmers are going to suffer. Farming, they had produced a ton of food during that period and even after that period. But now they had a surplus. They had more food than they could possibly sell, and which meant that the price of crops is going to drop. So they can't get the value of their crops. The farmers had taken out money to buy farm equipment, to buy seed, fertilizer, all of those things, pay workers. And the farmers couldn't pay them back because they weren't able to sell what they had overproduced. So they started defaulting on their loans, meaning they couldn't pay back those loans. That's what you call when you default. And because of this, the banks are going to foreclose on these farms, meaning the banks are going to take over the farms from the farmers and try to resell them. And of course, they're not going to get a lot of money because there aren't a lot of money out there. They would foreclose on the farms. And of course, the farmers couldn't pay back the loans, which are going to put the banks in jeopardy. And so the loan out, less the money, hurt the whole economy because, again, when these farmers couldn't pay back the banks, then the banks are going to lose money as well. And once again, the banks are going to start losing money and they're going to close. And again, people are going to lose their life savings. Let's look at two cycles here that were occurring in the 1920s. The first cycle is called deflationary spiral. And you need to know these two cycles so you'll have a good understanding of why the United States is going to have such economic hard times during this period. But let's look at deflationary spiral first. And we talked about mass production, and because of all the things being produced, we had falling demand, meaning that there wasn't a lot of demand to buy products, which meant that the prices of those products and other things began to fall as well. And because of those falling prices, the people weren't getting back the money that they had borrowed on loans. And of course, this means that they're going to default on their loans and the debt that they owed, which in return is going to affect banks and going to lead to bankruptcy for those people and cause the banks to have a lot of hard times as well. We also get layoffs, and the businesses and factories and companies weren't able to pay their workers. So again, they began laying them off. So we saw wage reductions as well. And then this whole cycle just keeps going round and round and round. This is the deflationary spiral. The other thing that you need to know is the economic cycle. And you get a peak, meaning you're at the peak of economic prosperity. Then you enter into a recession. The recession will sort of bottom out, which is the trough part of that, if you look at that diagram. And then you begin to recover slowly and surely. You get back to a peak again, and then boom, another recession. You get that trough again, and then recovery, and then peak again. So this was the cycle that the United States was sort of stuck in during the 1920s, leading up to the stock market. So after talking about all of this, we realized that the underlying problem in the 1920s was a decline in demand. Remember, we had overproduced. So you had a decline in demand and overproduction. And all of this were signs that were going to lead up to the stock market crash. And the stock market crash was a sign of this problem. It all comes about because of overproduction and drop in demand and the taking out of loans, buying on a margin, which you're going to watch about in a video. But all of those things are things that are going to lead to the Great Depression along with the stock market crash. So just remember that, and we're going to move on to talk about the stock market. With all the problems that were going on by the mid 1920s, the federal government had to respond. The people looked to the government to try to solve these problems. At the time, of course, we had a Republican government and they favored big business. One of the things that they put into place is something known as trickle down economics. And what trickle down economics did was it was mainly meant to help the top and the wealthy, and hopefully by giving them tax breaks and other advantages that they could actually take some of their money and invest in businesses, and the wealth would actually trickle down to the people below the extremely wealthy. To help the businesses, the government raised tariffs, and the Federal Reserve is going to play a role in all of this. But these tariffs, of course, tariffs or taxes, are going to cut foreign competition. Remember, we've talked about this in the past, how, of course, when we talked about nullification crisis and those other things, how tariffs were used to try to help businesses at home compete against foreign companies and foreign entities overseas. They overturned the child labor laws and the minimum wage for women as another way to try to respond. and they slashed income taxes for the wealthy. And again, this is using that trickle-down economics by giving them a tax break. Hopefully the wealthy would have more money. They can invest that money, which would eventually trickle down to the people below them. The Federal Reserve also would keep interest rates low and encourage borrowing, which is going to make the problem even worse and create even more debt. And because of these things, we're headed for a problem. And of course, the stock market crash is going to be that problem. So during the 1920s, people bought stock on margin. And what that means is that margin is buying more stock with a down payment, not the full price. So you're pretty much putting money down, and eventually you're going to pay it off, hoping that you're going to make money off of that stock. The problem was that sometimes this didn't happen. So you were taking a really big risk, and people were risking a lot of money during this period. People took more risk and speculated the values of stock, thinking that they would go up. And of course, all of this over speculation is going to create what we call a bubble, and that bubble eventually is going to burst. People realized the bubble was about to pop, and they rushed to the bank to sell their stock. But unfortunately, they're not going to be able to get the money back that they eventually put into it. The banks are going to run out of money, and they're going to close their doors. So banks are going to close down literally during this period as they ran out of money, because people were trying to sell their stock. And of course, this is going to lead to problems. All these conditions added up to what would be the stock market crash. And on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, we would see the greatest crash in stock market history.
There were no suicides on Wall Street that day. It was a myth that would grow over time. The real effect of October 29th took a little longer to sink in. By noon, all the gains of the previous year had been obliterated. By 4 p.m., nearly $10 billion of market value was gone. Over the next 2 weeks, the hemorrhage continued. And before long, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. A great national migration began. Displaced families took to the American highway in the last possession that remained to them, their automobile. And all at once, millions of Americans had a new definition of home.
With the stock market crash, the Great Depression begins. It was the worst economic disaster in U.S. history. Unemployment is going to reach a staggering rate of 25% during this period, the highest that it's ever been. People were unable to pay their mortgages or their rent. Many are going to go homeless. Suicide rates are going to go up during this period. And those that were still working had their wages and their hours cut, so they weren't getting a lot of money. This is going to lead to the bread lines and the soup kitchens, which you've heard about in the past. And of course, it's not a very good time for people living in the United States, and the people are needing relief. The federal government is going to try to step in, but it's going to be a little too late, and we'll see what happens.
Millions of American workers lost their jobs. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Only a handful of wealthy investors profited from the collapse of the stock market, like President John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, or brilliant investor and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, who became legendary as the man who sold out before the crash. Performer and humorist Will Rogers probably put it best.
10 men in our country could buy the whole world, and 10 million can't buy enough to eat.
So the millions of less fortunate Americans faced a grim and uncertain future. Soup kitchens and bread lines became as commonplace as the flappers and speakeasies of the Roaring '20s. And Herbert Hoover's campaign promise of a chicken in every pot couldn't have been farther from the truth. America's towns and cities struggled in vain to help the thousands in need. The jobless became the homeless. Shanty towns, makeshift communities of shacks constructed from wooden crates, tar paper, and cardboard sprang up. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles after the president, and the newspapers they slipped under, Hoover blankets.
Herbert Hoover is going to take a lot of the blame for the Great Depression. Of course, he's president during the beginnings of the Depression. And his idea was he believed that it wasn't up to the government to support the people. He thought that charities and private organizations should provide that support. One thing that began to pop up and a name that began to appear was something known as Hoovervilles. These were popular names for the shanty towns that would form outside of the large cities for people that were out of work and unable to get any money during the period. These were usually built in public parks, and of course they were not very attractive within the cities. Some other terms that were noticeable during that period were Hoover mobiles, and those were cars that were pulled by mules. Hoover blankets were the newspapers that they used during that period to put over themselves. Hoover stew was soup that you got from the soup kitchen, and Hoover hogs were the rabbits that were caught to eat during that period. The Great Plains states would actually go through what we refer to as the Dust Bowl. Crop prices began to drop, and farmers overplanted the fields during this period to make more money. And because they were doing this, they plowed off most of the topsoil, and most of the dirt that was left would turn to dust. And it's from years and years of planting as people began to migrate to the Midwest. To add even further to the problem, droughts would occur during this period, creating huge dust storms that would blow over the Midwest, blowing all the way out to Seattle and all the way across the Atlantic, almost 500 miles out. So the Dust Bowl was also a bad thing that happened during this period.
The Dust Bowl was a severe period of drought and dust storms throughout the 1930s. Why did the Dust Bowl happen? How severe was the damage? In the first 3 decades of the 1900s, there were significant and continuous advances in farming technology, including better tractors, mechanized plowing, combines, and more. From 1900 to 1920, the amount of farmland in the Plains region doubled, and from 1925 to 1930, the amount of cultivated land tripled. However, farmers of the era used practices which deprived the soil of its nutrients and increased the possibility of erosion. The heavy plowing had eliminated the natural grasses of the prairie that held the soil in place and maintained moisture. Then, in 1930, a severe drought struck the Great Plains region, which lasted nearly the entire decade. The regions affected most by this drought were the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, and a large portion of Colorado and New Mexico. The more than 1 million acres that was affected became collectively known as the Dust Bowl.
One such group that was trying to escape the Dust Bowl and the drought was a group that was often referred to as the Okies. The Okies were very poor migrants from Oklahoma, which is why, hence the name Okies. But they were also from many places in the Midwest. And again, they were fleeing the drought, they were fleeing the Dust Bowl, and they were moving to California. California was being advertised at the time as a perfect climate, an abundance of work, and agriculture. So a lot of these people were looking for jobs, looking for a better opportunity, and therefore they decided to move to California. A great novel that was written during this time was written by John Steinbeck. It's about a family moving from Oklahoma. It's called The Grapes of Wrath. So if you've ever read that book or even seen the movie, then you understand who the Okies were.
The Dust Bowl made life increasingly difficult for those living in the Central Plains. Many people decided to abandon their homes in search of new opportunities. Who were these people? Where did they go? Many left the Dust Bowl region in favor of trying to find a job in the city. Others decided to leave the area altogether. Most of those who left had a common destination: California. Writers of the era observed that the highways between Oklahoma and California resembled a parade, with a continuous string of cars heading west. Others compared it to the gold rush of 1849, with millions of migrants moving in search of a fresh start. In 1934 alone, Oklahoma lost more than 400,000 people. That same year, Kansas lost over 200,000. The Plains states as a whole experienced a loss of 2.5 million residents. Oklahoma suffered the most in terms of population loss. Other states lost 3% or 4% of their population, but some estimates claim that Oklahoma lost as much as 18% of its total population. Not all of the Dust Bowl refugees were from Oklahoma, but because so many of them were, the Californians had a nickname for all of them. They called them Okies. Journalist Ben Reddick first used the term Okie in his articles after noticing the OK abbreviation on many of the migrant license plates. Most of these Okies were heading to California because they thought they could find jobs picking fruit. After all, California supplied nearly half of the fresh fruit for the entire country.
Great Depression had a heavy impact on society. So the societal effects of the Great Depression included things such as a falling birth rate, meaning a lot of babies being born during this period. Marriages were even put off. People were afraid to get married. Schools were closed. Men abandoned their families because they couldn't afford to feed their families. And one event that really showed how bad things had gotten was a march by unemployed veterans from World War I. They actually marched on Washington, and the reason why they were marching on Washington was they wanted early payment of their promised bonuses. Of course, many of them being out of work and they needed money, so they looked to the government to go ahead and give them their bonuses. This group became known as the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army had to be dispersed by General George Patton of World War II fame. They used tear gas and actually ran those guys off of the property around the Capitol and around the White House. But it just showed how bad things had really gotten during this period.
World War I lasted from 1914 until 1918. In the end, much of Europe was in ruin. The Allies had triumphed and Germany had been defeated, and it was time for payback. The Allies, though America objected, presented the German government with a bill for 132 billion gold marks. That's billion with a B. It was twice Germany's annual income. Desperate, facing a bill they didn't have the money to pay, the Germans did just what America's Continental Congress did in 1777. They fired up the printing press and pumped out the paper. At the end of the war, $1 would buy roughly 4 marks. 5 years later, $1 would buy 4.2 trillion marks. That's trillion with a T. Ordinary citizens suffered the most. Germany's birth rate fell and the death rate rose. Infant mortality climbed by 21%, and on the black market, cigarettes became the new money. The government's money was so worthless, a whole wheelbarrow of it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. You might as well use it for wallpaper or for kindling. By 1930, all that crazy, out-of-control printing of money had destroyed the...
Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is going to be what occurs in Europe. Of course, the war is over with. Most of Europe is left devastated. The economies of many of these European countries have pretty much been wiped out, especially in Germany. Germany is going to be the one that's going to pay the biggest price. They're going to owe a lot of reparations, which you just saw in the video. So the way Germany's going to try to pay back these reparations is by printing a lot of money. And what that actually does is that actually raises inflation. So inflation gets out of control in Germany, and the actual German mark begins to lose its value. By November of 1923, it took 42 trillion marks to equal $1 US. So it got so bad that people were even carrying away money in wheelbarrows, which you've talked about in the past. But Germany, because of the high inflation, because of their economic woes, is going to open the door for eventually what will become Adolf Hitler.